you very much, Mr. Florenza. Hello to everybody. My name is Christian Herbolzheimer. I'm the director of the International Catalan Institute of Peace, a public and independent institute promoting a culture of peace, Catalan society and elsewhere. Today, we will be joined by Patrick Costello, former civil servant and EU diplomat, Carmen Gueja, research fellow at the EuroMed, and Youssef Sherif, director of Colombia Global Centers in Tunisia. And the session, as Mr. Florenza announced, was on enhancing EU soft power in the MENA region. This will be a session of some 55 minutes. Those of you who are listening to this session live are welcome to post comments and questions on the Zoom and under the Q&A section. So please do that anytime, and I will try to facilitate I hope a quite dynamic session with our speakers, and then introduce any questions or comments you may have in the conversation. Without any further ado then, I would start with a common question for all three speakers to frame our conversation, and from there on we'll go into more specific questions, either from my end for the three speakers, or I also invite you, dear panelists, to interact directly. Feel free to respond or react to any comments of your colleagues if you feel that would be appropriate, because I think that also makes for a much more lively discussion. To begin with, the European Union has been accused of applying double standards in regards to Russia's aggression on Ukraine and Israel's attack on Gaza. At the same time, it has also been accused of not putting enough effort into pushing for a political solution to the protracted Israel-Palestine conflict over the past years. What is, under these circumstances, your assessment of the role the EU has played in the past and is playing at present? And I'd invite Patrick to start with your observation.
Thank you very much, Christian. And perhaps to start with a very quick look at the past, I think the history of EU's role in the Middle East, it always was a history of the EU playing a role in a way of counterbalancing the US role. The US as a fully trusted interlocutor internationally by the Israelis, the EU counterbalancing that by being an interlocutor for the Palestinians. And in fact, it can be argued that when a peace agreement came close, for example, at Camp David under Clinton, the failure of that was in part due to the fact that the EU was not in the room. And therefore, the Palestinians were together with the Israelis and the Americans, did not have a trusted international interlocutor to support them in those negotiations. So in that context, what happened after October 7th was a very big shift. And some serious mistakes were made, not least by President von der Leyen in her early statements, and in the way in which she took the decision, or the Commission took the decision, to initially suspend all aid to the Palestinians, which they then reversed. I think it's fair to say that since that has happened, thanks in large part to the work of Josep Borrell, the High Representative, those mistakes have been, I would say, largely undone. But it is never, and it will never be possible for the EU alone to achieve or an international settlement, or to broker an international settlement in the region. That also requires the Americans, because any agreement would have to be between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And in that situation, when you have, as Mr. Borrell said a couple of days ago, you have an Israeli government that is actively not seeking a solution, makes it almost impossible to move forward. There is the additional problem, which I think is one that could be overcome, which is also that the member states of the EU are on very, very different positions. Between, on the one hand, Spain, who's recently recognized Palestine, and on the other, Germany, or the Czech Republic, Hungary. So you have very serious differences there. Those can be overcome. They've been overcome in the past. But in a situation where both the Israelis and the Americans are not prepared to really move into a settlement situation, or into at least towards a ceasefire even, that makes it extremely difficult. I'll leave it there as an introduction. Thank you.
Wonderful, Patrick. And interesting looking back, your assessment that the EU's absence in Camp David is maybe one of the reasons why the process did not work. Yusuf, and sorry, Carmen first. Carmen, what's your assessment?
Yes, good morning, and thank you for kickstarting the conversation in terms of framing. I also want to say, before I start, where I come from to this. I was an academic in Lebanon. I was an associate professor until 2022. I moved to Spain 2.5 years ago. I engaged with this conversation on the EU soft power from the perspective of research and civil society, having been an activist. That's my viewpoint. I am not a diplomat, and I'm not an expert on EU-Arab relations. And so that said, my perspective from activism and academia is that, first of all, the EU is not seen as a monolithic entity. There's a lot of discrepancies among member states on the issue of Palestine. And I think that European Union representatives play on this bilateral relations between European countries and the region, and the attempted multilateral stance on on the Israeli war in Gaza, and that doesn't help. I also think, from my experience and having been now on this side of the world, is that EU actors among themselves, whether they are staff, civil servants, people working on freedom of speech, peace building, they're not also acting in a monolithic way. I feel that there's a lot of disconnect among EU institutions and instruments of working in the Middle East, between a very political level, at the level of von der Leyen and Josep Borrell, and at the level of civil servants, particularly people that have been engaging a lot on questions of Palestine for many decades. And I bring in my experience. I worked in Libya post-2011. I also saw the disconnect there. And in Lebanon, after the Beirut blast, there was also this perspective of a huge disconnect between people working in European Union on issues like protection and freedom, and what is happening at the EU level officially in terms of a multilateral entity. And so EU is not a monolithic entity. It's not seen as a monolithic entity. Where it does play as an official representative of member states, it tends to be concerned mainly with migration crisis. It tends to be concerned with high-level conversations with very little regard, I think, for human lives lost, particularly in the Israeli aggression. Today, we are at an estimated 40,000 people killed by Israel. And I think that this is contributing very negatively to people's ability on the ground to count on EU as a potential partner, ally, or even a moral reference when it comes to the rules of war, the rules of engagement, ceasefire, and people's lives and well-being. So I'll stop at that, but that's how I look at it. I need to break it down. Like I said, I'm not working on diplomacy. Those of us on the ground working on things like inclusive peace and bringing voices to the table need to unpack this complexity. And so yeah, it's not a monolithic entity. It plays on that whenever it wants to, and it's slowly losing political and moral ground. And I'm not talking only for people who are in the Arab world, but on colleagues and friends in Brussels and across Europe.
Thank you for that perspective, Carmen, and over to Youssef.
Thank you. I think we've seen several EUs during the last 2 years, and my co-panelists touched on this. So on Ukraine, it's less obvious since the war represents a direct threat to Europe. But on Gaza, it's crystal clear, and on 2 levels. The first one is that the situation in Brussels looks like a forced cohabitation between 2 divergent groups. So we have Ursula von der Leyen and whatever she represents, who openly supports Israel, and Josep Borrell, who is on the opposite side. At least this is how we see it from the region. So the image of the EU or the governance of the EU looked like a forced cohabitation, akin to having a right-wing president and a socialist foreign minister, and that kept growing month after month. The second level is that the divergence of views between the different European powers. And again, my co-panelists mentioned this. So if we look at the powerhouses, we have Germany and to a certain extent France, Italy, and the Netherlands standing on Israel's side, and then Spain, Belgium, and fewer other countries almost on the Palestinian side. Now, the support for either side, it's more rhetorical than anything. In reality, on Gaza, the EU has been mostly a loudspeaker, not an actor. And if you look at the history of previous escalations or initiatives involving the Middle East, this time during this Gaza war, in comparison, marks, I think, one of the most noted EU absences of the European Union and of the Europeans I can think of. I mean, the US is there, the UK is there. We've seen a lot of initiatives, largely in support of Israel. We've seen weapons going to Israel from these 2 countries. And then the EU as an institution is struggling to do something concrete. And interestingly, in this vacuum, I mean, I don't know if it's because of the vacuum or the absence of the EU or not, but in any case, we see a new player who joined in compared to the last 20 or 30 years. And this new player is Iran. And Iran is today almost the interlocutor for the Palestinians, not through negotiations, of course, through military means, but if you are a Palestinian, then you have the US, the UK, and many European countries against you. And the only one who's giving you support is Iran. So we have this new player, Iran, and a big absentee, which is the EU. I guess the war on Ukraine and the dysfunctions in Brussels had their tolls on EU Middle East foreign policy, but it's notable. And if we're looking at the image of the EU or the future of the EU in the region, well, what has happened over the last year is clearly very bad news for Brussels. Thank you.
Thank you, Youssef. You have all 3 highlighted what Carmen calls their different EUs and different perspectives. It seems the EU can't escape the trend of polarization. It seems like in this conflict, you either are pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. It's like difficult to carve an identity as an actor that is pro-peace, and therefore able to support both Israel and Palestine if and when they have peace initiatives, peace efforts, or peace commitments. Patrick, you know the EU very well from inside. Borrell has just come back from a visit and he was not met by the Israel authorities. Clearly, they're punishing him for, I don't know, for taking sides or just speaking truth, uncomfortable truth, or for what reason. He produced some principles that tried to guide the EU's approach, bridging these divides, which Youssef mentioned between von der Leyen and Borrell. I don't know if you think it's relevant to share what these principles are essentially with the audience, and whether that's something that has any traction, can have continuity knowing that Borrell will soon step down as High Representative and somebody else will take his place?
Yeah, I think perhaps just before I go into that, just because I think it's relevant to the answer, this question of different EUs, because I think Carmen and Yusuf are both absolutely right, and I don't want to understate it, but I also think it's important to look at when it has been possible for the EU to find that unity of purpose, despite those differences, both between member states and between governments and between high-level political interlocutors and officials. Middle East is actually a very good example of that, because when the EU enlarged in 2005, it brought in a number of countries who had very, very different views on Israel and Palestine from the EU position. And it took a very, very long time, I mean, a matter of years, even for the EU to be able to restate the position it had. But the traditional position of support for two-state solution, et cetera, et cetera. But it was able to do so, and part of the reason it was able to do so was because, and I was present at some of those negotiations in sort of 2010, 2011. It was possible because everyone in the room recognized that not coming to an agreement would have serious consequences for the EU as a whole, and therefore for all of them. And I think you can see the same kind of thing happening. Yusuf mentioned Ukraine, where there has been, maintenance of a certain level of unity. There are similar kinds of differences over Ukraine among member states, and sometimes those emerge publicly and so on. But it's different because there is a recognition that the EU as a whole needs to move forward. So why is that not happening now? Is the question. I think it's there are a number of reasons for it. I think what Borrell is trying to do is to pull together a possible way forward on the basis of existing long-term commitments that the EU has in black and white that have not been changed at any stage, right? It's more about how they're applied under the specific circumstances, but the EU policy remains the same. To me, it will only change, and this is less about individuals and more about structural recognition, if you like, of the fact that it is, as Yusuf said, damaging for the EU not to maintain a clearly united position, and it has caused a lot of damage over the last 9 months or so. Will that change with new personnel? I think it's a little bit early to tell, because we know that Kaja Kallas, who will be replacing Borrell, assuming the hearings go well and so on, in November or December. We know that her foreign policy focus as an Estonian prime minister has been eastwards, not southwards. We also know that there have been a number of conversations with her during the process leading up to her nomination from member states who were concerned about that and wanted to make sure that a certain focus was maintained on the south. And then you throw into that mix that von der Leyen is going to have in her team this time a commissioner dedicated to the Mediterranean. And the question of who that will be will also have a very big impact, and whether that person can work well with Kaja Kallas as the High Representative. We won't know what those proposals are until next week. They were just postponed, the portfolios of the new commission. And I think once those personnel are in place, it will start to become clear where different areas of action at political level will take place. One last thing about the difference in the way that the political level and the officials work. This is the first time in 30 years that I've been working, in the EU institutions. I'm no longer there, but it's the first time that there was a very public and active petition by EU officials taken against the position that the leadership had taken in the first months on Gaza. There was a petition that was signed by several hundred officials that came out publicly. This has never happened on any area of policy. And I think that's a sign of just how difficult it has been for officials seeing their political leaders doing things which are actually outside of the frame of the policies that have already been set, and how strong a reaction that provokes. Thanks.
But can I follow up on that a little bit? Because the war has now been going on for almost a year. And of course, the discrepancies internally were very evident at the beginning of the war, of the Israeli response to Hamas attack and atrocities. But then, time has passed on, and to what extent have these initial differences already somehow been overcome, and this awareness of the need that it's in the EU's interest to have a common policy on this conflict, and that actually we have already agreed on a number of issues, but we haven't pushed for them, right? Have some things changed in member states' approach throughout the months, and now looking forward, or have they remained stuck and almost sort of taking sides, and they don't move from that position?
Yeah, there are kind of two answers to that question. One is that as the war goes on, and as it becomes clearer and clearer that the Israeli government is hostage to its most extreme elements, and that the strategy of the Israelis, of the current Israeli government, is damaging to EU interests. As that becomes clearer and clearer, I mean, when you see what's been happening in the West Bank, when you see the risks of another front opening in southern Lebanon, and the perception in many capitals that this is being driven by essentially the need, the desire of the Israeli government to survive, that Smotrich and Ben Gvir are essentially holding it hostage. The longer that goes on, the more there is discussion and awareness, certainly at official levels rather than political level, of the need to pull that position together. And linked to that is the fact that I think there's a common awareness that what happened in the first couple of months was a serious mistake. I mean, even if you look at the statements by von der Leyen, they've changed.
As you said, stopping the aid was reversed, and other measures.
Exactly. So that's one answer to the question: is that the longer this horrible conflict goes on, the more the risks, the security risks to the EU become apparent to everyone, and that has a way of concentrating minds. At the same time, some of the discussions that did take place at political level at that time have left scars. So, and those are quite difficult to overcome. And it's a question of, when one overtakes the other. I mean, I think it's therefore a very, very difficult question to answer. A very good question, but a very difficult question to answer as to when will that tipping point come, when the Europeans realize that it is fundamentally in their interests to come up with a united approach to this that has clout? Yeah.
You mentioned now it's in the EU's interest, most likely. Carmen, going back to you, you mentioned in your first intervention that but the EU is actually not a relevant political player in the region. It's not perceived as being one. So maybe the EU are having their internal soul-searching conversations, identity-searching conversations, and whatnot. But you've lived most of your life in Lebanon. You have lived extremely close and impacted by this protracted conflict. Does the EU is not perceived as a player, as a relevant player right now, as you mentioned, but can that change? Would it be good to change, or is the scenario completely different and the conversations the EU are having is sort of in their internal bubble and detached from people's everyday reality?
Yeah, Christian, I'm really scared. I think like lots of people, I'm very scared at what's happening on the ground, but also at our narrative. I find it very concerning that everything is up for grabs, right? If we weaponize aid to refugees that have been occupied for 75 years, if we question, the ability of people to have dignified access to water, if we consider the killing of 200 journalists, hundreds of academics, tens of thousands of children, if we as a community of practice, as researchers, as human beings, as citizens, if we begin to consider these as polarizing issues, it's like a justification. Okay, people can have two views on a war, and that's okay. No problem. This is a polarizing issue. I'm very scared because what are the instruments today of peace? What is peace? There's conflict. Warring factions come, people contribute hopefully to that peace. So peace is not imposed, like in the case of Lebanon, the way that the civil war ended was an agreement among a bunch of men, about a bunch of warlords, and then there was peace. And the story of Lebanon, I think, is a cautionary tale to how not to do peace. So we want to talk about peace today. There has to be a minimum agreement of what constitutes a human life, dignity, access to justice before we talk about this. So I'm scared that I feel really everything is up for grabs. So I resort to my place of comfort, the same what I demanded from my government when I was living in Lebanon: accountability, justice, escape from impunity. I would apply those same principles for me living in Europe today. I want accountability for officials that have justified the killing of babies on both ends. I want accountability and transparency for the way that people, everyday people, human beings, if you kill nurses and poets and activists and academics and professors and diplomats and journalists, who's going to come to the peace table? So I'm very scared, and I feel that this weaponization of EU borders, of all what EU is seen as interested in the region, is migration. People are dying at sea. I'm scared of approaching any conversation with no minimum standard. If human rights is polarizing, I don't know where we're going to start, right? I understand the complexity of the conflict. I've lived there my whole life. I mean, there are 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, estimated third generation, that don't have rights. I condone my own government, Lebanon, for not providing those rights. I'm not belittling the conflict, and I'm not saying that there cannot be multiple sides to seeing occupation and borders. But today, the killing of 40,000 people cannot be a polarizing issue. It's not in Sudan. It's not in Ukraine. Here, becoming a polarizing issue, I'm finding it difficult to find common grounds for peace. And so I'll hold my thoughts onto the last segment, because I know that you will ask us about the realistic hope. But I think that we should admit complicity when we see it, condemnation. I think we should admit that there are nations today not willing to recognize tens of deaths for that reason, and then come to this table in an informed manner. And I'm scared. I'm not sure that we have the right instruments, but I'm worried that we use polarization and divisiveness as a normality. And people are divided on this issue. Therefore, it's okay. Let's go for another year. It has been a year of daily killings of hospitals, and let's go for another year. Maybe this polarization will end, I don't know, in 5 years, in 10 years. When will polarization end? And we can actually sit down, look at the ICJ court decision, discuss occupation, root causes of issues, structural issues. I'm concerned that we're still very far from this. And it's very damaging, and it's damaging for people on the ground that look at EU partners and European societies as potential allies in human rights, in freedom of expression, in democratic elections, in accountability, right? Look, it's people on the ground saying, well, if the EU is like that, if the UN can stop, funding schools for refugees, what are we gonna do? Who should we resort to, right? And this radicalizes, this damages not the EU, which I'm very concerned with, and it's my new home, but damages people also on the ground that are working towards peace, that are working towards reform and justice. They don't have any allies anymore. We left them alone. We left women, we're not talking about Afghanistan today, but we left women, basically to fend for themselves, and that's what we're doing. I'm scared for organizations, for people in Palestine, in Lebanon, in areas that are experiencing this conflict that have no allies, because the issue is polarizing.
And probably even far beyond the region, because it seems like we do have human rights standards, we do have international humanitarian law, and then we have the double standards we mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, when EU looks at these instruments in one way in one context, in another way in another context, not to mention the context where nobody pays attention at all, right?
And everything is up for grabs, right? The Convention on Refugees, 1951, maybe we'll see where it applies. The ICJ court decision, no, it's polarized. What are today the instruments of peace that people on the ground can resort to? I'm not sure.
We have encouraged participants, listeners, to ask questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom. We have one already, Maya Sion. We'll get to that immediately after I give the floor to Youssef to comment.
Thank you. So again, back to the issue of the divergent policies of states. I think it's perfectly normal. The problem is that the EU is trying to overcome all that and to claim that it speaks with one voice. But then clearly on Gaza, it's not a one voice. The EU does not speak with one voice either when it comes to democracy promotion. And if I go to the perception from this side of the world, then you find the EU perceived as a continuation of the colonialism as a continuation of the colonial powers of the last century. Even if some of its members were never into the business of colonialism. And now with the politicization, migration, and the increase of migrants, something that Carmen actually writes about, I think, the EU is laughed by a growing number of youth from the Southern Mediterranean because their visas get rejected, and so they see the EU as a wall, not as a friend. So I think this part makes the EU in a position that is more and more difficult. And Kristen, you asked me about the countries of the region where I come from, so about the countries of North Africa. I think,
and yeah, the northern, because different countries in Northern Africa have different relationships with Israel, right?
That's correct. Well, it's actually Morocco that has diplomatic ties with Israel, but the majority of the Moroccan population disapproves of these diplomatic ties. Of course, Morocco is, I think, partly free when it comes to the ranking of Freedom House. But anyway, there are several polls that show that more and more Moroccans disapprove of these relationships. Now, when it comes to the other North African countries, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, they are on the same side, radically opposed to Israel. in the past, Tunisia was closer to Morocco on this issue, and the place where some negotiations took place. But today we see a bloc from Libya to Algeria staunchly opposed to Israel. And that's due to, on the one hand, to the very clear and strong public sentiment in these countries in support of the Palestinians, especially after all what happened since October 7th. And also because of the political calculations of these governments and their neo-pan-Arabism that pushes them to take these positions, also to keep their populations more or less happy. But in any case, I mean, I don't see any political settlement.
Sorry, and what about Egypt?
Well, Egypt, I mean, that's the most closed authoritarian system in the region. So obviously the population is very much pro-Palestinian, but the government is trying to balance between the implications of having between the advantages of having political ties, diplomatic ties with Israel, and not to have a popular explosion in the country. So we see Egypt in the and Egypt is in a special position because it's right next to Israel, because it has a history of wars with Israel. It's not like the rest of North Africa where leaders can more or less do whatever they want. They're not directly impacted. Egypt is directly impacted, but I mean the Egyptian leadership is in a bad position because for a growing number of people in the region, the Egyptians are failing the Palestinians. And if you think of soft power and what Sisi tried to do since he came to power in 2013 to portray himself as a new Nasser and as a new leader in the Arab world with these Arab conferences on military affairs, youth meetings, etc., etc. Well, today he's the one actually who is closing the borders on Gaza, and he's been criticized from all sides. But Egypt has a lot of other issues that it has to tackle. But yeah, I mean, I don't see these countries playing any role when it comes to peaceful solution in the region. And in any case, the situation in Gaza needs more humanitarian solution than peaceful solution at this point.
Yeah, we'll get there in a minute, and again, we'll answer Maya's question in a minute. But I wanted to hear Yusuf, because you're based in Tunisia, and you mentioned the popular support towards Palestine. However, it seems, at least from mainstream media, that where there have been demonstrations in one sense or another, but around the conflict in the Middle East, the main ones have been in the US, a little bit in Europe, and not much in the Arab world. Is that correct? And what's your interpretation for that?
Well, no, that's correct. I mean, especially if you compare to the kind of demonstrations that used to happen 20 or 30 years ago during the Intifada or during the Iraq War and all these things. Now, my interpretation, at least when it comes to Tunisia, I think the government took, and I've never seen the Tunisian government taking such a pro-Palestinian position openly and without any gloves. So I think while in the past, these kind of demonstrations, people would demonstrate for Palestine and at the same time against their government, at least in the case of Tunisia, that's not really happening, because demonstrating with Palestine is actually at the same, I mean, the government is on the same side. So people do not exactly see the need to go out and demonstrate, because their government is doing exactly what they're saying when it comes to the question of Palestine. Then, I mean, in Algeria, also same thing when it comes to Palestine. In Morocco, we've seen huge demonstrations. Every now and then there is a big demonstration in Rabat or Casablanca. But then when it comes to freedom of expression, a place like Morocco, and even so a place like Egypt, it's not very easy to do that. But you look, for instance, at Jordan, actually, there are almost weekly demonstrations. And in the case of Jordan, which is the level of freedoms in Jordan is comparable to the level of freedoms in Morocco, for instance. So people actually do face some risks when they demonstrate, but still we see hundreds of thousands demonstrating every month, and the regime actually is actually very, very scared because of these ongoing threats. So for its existence. So we do see demonstrations here and there, but it's mostly, you're right, I mean, mostly in Europe and the US, where I think it's explained by the fact that there is a change in public opinion in comparison to 20 or 30 years ago. And I think Carmen mentioned this, we should not forget that what we've seen in the last year in Gaza, I mean, this is one of the most brutal wars against civilians we've ever seen in the last few decades. I mean, this is comparable to what Assad did in Syria, to what is happening in Sudan, maybe, and it's a huge humanitarian toll. So people are revolted in many parts of the world, and especially in places where their governments are openly supporting Israel.
Thank you, Youssef. I'm sure, Carmen, you might want to jump in on that in a minute as well from a Lebanon perspective. But I wanted to pick up the question we have from Maya Sion. And again, please encouraging anybody else to ask questions. We are now looking forward. The frame for this last section of our conversation is, okay, so what next? Where do we go from here? And Maya helps us in this direction. She would like to ask participants to relate to Hamas. The name has not been mentioned until now, she comments, only Palestinians. Now, in practical terms, can a political solution be achieved with Hamas? And what should be or not be Hamas' role in the day after the war? Who wants to comment? Not all at the same time.
I'll start if no one else wants to. Look, I think in the discussions that I've been involved with, there is, I mean, let's talk about the day after first. I mean, whenever that day finally comes. I think there is a certainly among the international community and the region, almost a consensus that it is impossible to have a day after governance in Gaza, which pretends that Hamas doesn't exist, right? Maybe put it like that. Now, how concretely that could be achieved, it's really, I think, largely a matter for the Palestinians to decide. But there has been a lot of talk about the idea of some kind of technocratic governance, where the political factions, Fatah and Hamas and so on, would not be directly involved in the government, but would approve it, if you like, and that would be the way forward. Too early to tell. When it comes to a peace settlement, again, it's really very much up to the Palestinians as a whole to decide who represents them, and I think it's very hard for anyone else to tell them that. And you know, for many years before October 7th, there were efforts which consistently failed of reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. If they had been achieved, it would have made, I think, a significant difference to governance in the occupied territories in Palestine. And it would have made them a much stronger negotiator in any process of reaching peace with the Israelis. Just perhaps one point to mention here is that one of the strategies of dividing the Palestinian population over 20, 30 years has been to separate them into different groups. So you have the West Bank with the Palestinian Authority, Fatah run. You have Hamas running Gaza. You have the refugees. You have the so-called Arab Israelis, i.e. the Palestinians living in 1948 territory in Israel. And one of the things that has been happening in the last few years is that some of those boundaries have been breaking down in response to the increasing settlements in East Jerusalem, for example. If the Israelis continue to pursue the strategy that they're now pursuing in the West Bank, that process of those walls between different Palestinian communities that they spent so much effort carefully building up will shatter. And those distinctions will matter less. And my fear, one of my fears, I mean, I share all of the fears that Carmen mentioned, but one of my fears is that, if you like, the result will be a much more radicalized Palestinian leadership to match the ever-increasing radicalization of the Israeli leadership. And that makes any process of peace building even harder to achieve. Thanks.
So actually, maybe inviting you, Carmen, and Youssef to comment, I can add to the question of Hamas' role in the day after. Is there a role for the current Israeli government in any day after in a peace building role? Because at the end of the day, who has been in power, who was in power on October 7 in Gaza and was in power in Israel for the last years are the both extremes who are pushing for wiping out the other side. And obviously, under these circumstances, it's difficult. And at the same time, they are key players. Carmen?
Yeah, you know, I was struggling a lot in preparing for the session mentally and politically, and thinking about your questions, Christian, related to peace. Those of us that are in peace building and working towards inclusive peace, whether at the national level, global level, understand that the end of violent hostilities is not enough to create peace, but it's a requirement, right? I mean, at least before we can talk about who will come to the peace table and what peace will look like and what are the topics of negotiation, at least the guns and the bombs should stop. And so I'm worried in this conflict that we are still at the ceasefire. And it's very difficult to ignore the daily death rate as reported by Oxfam, United Nations, Amnesty International. There was an article in Haaretz saying that the death toll approaching 40,000 people is one of the highest rates of death per day and pace of death exceeding the conditions of people who are still alive, even in places like Iraq and Myanmar and Ukraine. And so I'm very scared on this issue, and I'm not sure I can answer. I mean, I think there is a global recognition. There's consensus today, thanks to mobilization of students all over the world, of actors, of diplomats, of the understanding that October 7 was a trigger of a much longer and larger and structural problem. I think the ICJ court decision on occupation is extremely clear and backed by evidence. And so I would find it very difficult both to speak on behalf of the Palestinian people and to speak of any day after before at least one requirement of peace, which is the stopping of the killing, and then we can talk. So I'm concerned of this, and I come at it, so I want to be clear on the positionality of Lebanon, where there was a war of 170,000 people, where there was only the only requirement, which was the stopping of the war, brought warring factions together. It did not resolve the problem. Lebanon today is in shambles. And so I would insist on, if we are talking from a peace culture, that there is first an immediate ceasefire and humanitarian aid be allowed. And then talking, because we are sitting here in nice capitals talking about this. Maybe if I was on the ground, I would have a much stronger opinion, no? If I was on any side of the conflict, maybe if we ask someone from Palestine to weigh in. But from my sense, sitting comfortably in my house in Europe, I would say at least we stop the killing from our perspective. If this was a talk about negotiation, agenda items, requirements, who are today factions that are allowed to come to the peace table? In Lebanon, people with tens of thousands in their neck came and made peace and proceeded to govern. I'm not saying that anybody should come to the peace table, but I think from my perspective right now, this is a philosophical argument that we can continue. I feel I owe it to the audience, to who we are, the researchers and activists and former diplomats, to say at least immediately a call for a ceasefire is what we need to stick to.
Yusuf.
Thank you. I'll just try to suggest 4 recommendations. And as Carmen said, I mean, I don't think we can tell the Palestinians who are suffering now what they should do, but more maybe the things that I would say are more directed towards Europe, towards the EU. Now, you know, Barcelona, Madrid, and Oslo, they're all European cities. And they are some of the brightest chapters in the history of Palestine-Israel, where negotiations that led to something not perfect, but not extremely bad, took place. But where are they now? Where is the spirit of European convening and mediation power? This is my first point. I think the EU should convene a major conference on Palestine-Israel. The EU does good conferences, and I think this is something doable that the US or the UK cannot do because of their position. But the EU, through that history and what Patrick mentioned earlier, the fact that they used to be seen almost as an interlocutor for the Palestinians, that's something they can do. Now, the second point, now at this juncture, after tens of thousands were killed in Gaza, it will be difficult to bring people together. And of course, the EU has its own problems. So I'm not saying that it would be easy to set up that peace conference. But then there are states like Spain or Ireland that are in the EU, have their say, and that also gained a lot of credibility in the Arab world and among the Palestinians during this war. And these countries, at the same time, they continue to entertain more or less normal relationships with Israel. Can the EU mandate Spain or Ireland to take the lead and start a new round of negotiations? I think this is a possibility. My third point, again, going back to these same EU states that were less openly supportive of Israel, they can reach out to the groups that are considered radical and among the Palestinians and try to open a negotiation round. And here I'm talking about Hamas and groups that are currently fighting in Gaza, but that are not rejected by everyone. Because ultimately negotiations will have to take place, and you cannot erase a group completely. Now some people are saying, yes, we will get rid of Hamas, but then look at Afghanistan. After 20 years, the Taliban are back. Do you want the same thing? I mean, all this destruction, all this money spent, and then you have the same issue coming back, because then you have more rooted problems. And Hamas, some people were able to negotiate with Hamas in the last 20 years. So someone needs to talk to these, to those that no one wants to talk to. And I think countries like Spain or Ireland can reach out to these kind of groups that are now completely boycotted by some sides. And my fourth and final point, I think the EU can step up delivering aid to the Palestinians. it is already doing a lot, and it will never. I mean, it will never do as much as the US or the UK are doing when it comes to weapons to Israel in terms of humanitarian aid. But the EU can do more, and it can recover part of its shattered image by increasing aid and making it known. Because again, I mean, it's unfair to say that the EU is not doing anything. The EU is providing humanitarian aid, and Borrell and others are trying to do things. So this should be increased, and this should be known for everyone, because ultimately humanitarian aid should not be negotiable, and it should reach those who are in need. So these are my 4 points, and I conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf, for these very clear points, which therefore you are already answering the last question I had, and I now throw over to Patrick and Carmen. So with all its limitations, could you hint to any key actions or gestures the EU could undertake, not to build peace, but at least to contribute to an environment that is more conducive to peace? And actually, the second question Maya Sion asks in the Q&A, I think, goes in the same direction. So Patrick first, and then Carmen.
Well, picking up from where Yusuf left off, when I wrote the piece for Afkar, I outlined that there were 4 areas in which the EU could be doing things. One is in the area of what it says publicly, which I think has changed a lot since the piece was written, is going in the right direction. Second area is diplomacy, and that includes recognition of Palestine. So the fact that a number of countries, a number of member states have already recognized Palestine is a step forward. But if others did, that would create a new diplomatic fact on the ground. The third area that we haven't talked about a lot is leverage. The EU is a pretty important economic player in the region, and there have been, under the Association Council with Israel, there are provisions relating to human rights and so on. It wouldn't be the first time that those things have been, or the possibility of sanctions in that area have been raised with the Israelis. It happened after Jenin in 2001. It could happen again. Leverage is not purely about military security leverage. There are other aspects to it. And then finally, there is creating the conditions for negotiations. And in fact, just to mention that it is in fact the European Council, the heads of state and government signed up to a statement in December where they said, they basically committed to organizing an international conference. It hasn't moved. I think it's important also to look at the examples that Yusuf mentioned. Yes, they're European cities. In the case of Madrid, of course, it was an American conference that was hosted in Madrid. In the case of Oslo, it's also under the Americans as a back channel from Madrid. The Norwegians were able then to negotiate that back channel. The one that was really a European conference was Barcelona. Barcelona was in a way launching a process that could only fully develop if the peace process between Israel and Palestine had worked. So, I mean, it left certain things that were good in themselves, but the philosophy behind the Barcelona conference was to in a way generate the regional advantages that would come out of a normalization of Israeli relations with the rest of the region. I give all this information because I think it sort of when you're then looking at what kind of a conference could be set up, and I agree with Yusuf that now's not the time, and I agree with Carmen that we have to wait for the killing to stop, and for there to be a ceasefire before we can get anywhere with this. But in order for it to happen, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning, this requires the Americans as well as the EU. It's not something that the EU can do alone. Why? Because the Israelis will not participate in a process that is EU-led. And I suspect that's even more the case if Spain or Ireland took the initiative to do that. And if you're going to have progress in a process, in an international conference, I think it requires, even if the two parties are not sitting down in the same room, they need to both be in some way engaged in the process through proximity talks or whatever. And therefore, the only player that could help in getting the Israelis to do that would be the Americans. It's not going to be the Europeans, as the Israeli refusal to receive Borrell last week showed. Thanks.
Thanks for this reality check, Patrick. Carmen, you have the last word.
I'll be brief. In addition to what my colleague said, at that level, I think also within Europe, peace requires justice and truth. And I think that within European member states, I think it's very important to shy away from oppressing people that are telling the history of this conflict and sharing the Arab perspective on this. I think it's very important that we can take cue from our students that Europe also doesn't suppress within it opposition to the war, that there is a continuation among people, I'm very grateful that I'm living in Spain. There is weekly mobilization to end the bloodshed. That's not the case in many parts of the world. And I think that there needs to be work within European institutions, universities, and on the streets, and with police forces to allow for that call for truth and justice to happen. I think that that mobilization would be a requirement, I think, together in parallel with a political conference, big P political. We need to continue working on the grassroots and allowing for that to breathe and not to become oppressors for people living inside Europe. That's all I would add.
Thank you so much, Carmen. And with this, we come to an end of our 1 hour session. We did not pretend to come up with a recipe for peace between Israel and Palestine. The framework of this conversation was enhancing the EU soft power in the MENA region. And all three speakers have come up with, I think, very thought-provoking and relevant and complementary observations, which I think contribute to achieving the purpose of our session today. With this, thank you for watching, and over, I think, to Senen Florenza to make your closing remarks.
No, it's not a final remark. It's only to thank you all for your participation, as well, people who have been following the debate. I think it has been very insightful and useful. We are working on different initiatives that try to contribute to I don't know, to proceed forward in the best possible way, let's put it that way. And I can assure you that your comments have been very much insightful and even clarifying and illuminating in many different ways. So thank you very much for all your participation, and see you in the next edition of these debates, which if it is as it is now, it is very much promising. And we will keep going on. We will ask you to participate again, either in written form in Afkar or these kind of debates. And thank the Christian for all you have done, and the audience as well. So see you in the next edition. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Okay.
Bye, Christian.
Okay, are we offline now?
Gracias.
Sí, ya estamos offline.
Sí, sí, creo que sí, 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 sí. Oh,
Ok.
no, gracias.